The alien fleet drifted aimlessly in the cold vacuum of space, its once mighty ships battered and broken. The faint glow of dying engines illuminated the emptiness around them, casting long, eerie shadows over hulls scarred from relentless attacks. They were stranded far from their homeworld, surrounded by silence and despair, caught in the unforgiving grip of the unknown. They had sent distress signals out into the void, not knowing if anyone would hear or care enough to respond. The humans did. The message reached Earth's Outer Space Reconnaissance Division, garbled and desperate. At first, the officers monitoring deep space communications dismissed it as interference or a remnant from an old satellite. But then, as the signal was enhanced, the pleading tones of alien voices became unmistakable. They spoke a language no human had heard before, but the desperation transcended translation. Something had gone horribly wrong, and it wasn't hard to infer the truth. A fleet in trouble, alone and vulnerable, was calling for help. Humanity's place in the galaxy was tenuous at best. Earth was still considered a minor player on the cosmic stage, often overlooked or underestimated by the sprawling empires and coalitions that dominated the stars. Despite this, humans had built a reputation for being unpredictable, stubbornly resourceful, and willing to extend a hand where others would turn away. It was this reputation that prompted a swift decision. Earth would send a team. They couldn't ignore a cry for help, alien or not. Commander Vera Langdon stood in the briefing room aboard the Resolute, a mid-sized but heavily equipped rescue vessel. Her sharp green eyes scanned the team she had handpicked for this mission. They were a mix of engineers, medics, and security personnel, all volunteers. Langdon's face was calm, but beneath her composure was the weight of responsibility. No one knew what they would find out there, and the risks were impossible to calculate. "We're not just doing this because it's the right thing," Langdon began, her voice steady but firm. "We're doing it because it's who we are. Earth has a chance to show the galaxy what humanity stands for. Compassion, cooperation, strength. If we succeed, it won't just be about saving lives. It'll be about proving we belong among the stars." The crew murmured their agreement, though some couldn't suppress their doubts. Alien species weren't always kind to their saviors. Sometimes gratitude turned into resentment or worse. But Langdon's words carried a spark that ignited something deeper, a belief that they had to try. The journey to the signal's origin was fraught with tension. As the ship navigated through uncharted space, the crew prepared for every possibility. The engineers fine-tuned drones and repair equipment. The medics rehearsed triage protocols, and the security team ensured their weapons were ready. Despite the focus on their tasks, unease hung in the air like a heavy fog. The distress signal had been repeating on a loop, but it offered no details about what had caused the fleet's predicament. Pirates? A natural disaster? A rival alien force? The possibilities were endless, and none of them were comforting. When the Resolute finally arrived at the source of the signal, the sight that greeted them was sobering. The alien fleet floated in disarray, their once sleek ships now riddled with holes and blackened from explosions. Some vessels had clearly lost power, their lights extinguished, while others seemed barely operational, sputtering weak bursts of energy as if clinging to life. Langdon ordered the ship to maintain a cautious distance while scans were conducted. "Commander," said Dr. Elias Torin, the chief science officer, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the data. "Their systems are catastrophically damaged. Life support is failing on at least half the ships. If we don't act fast, we're looking at a mass casualty situation." Langdon nodded, her mind racing through the options. They couldn't dock with every ship. They didn't have the capacity for that kind of operation. Instead, they'd have to prioritize stabilizing the fleet's critical systems and evacuating the most vulnerable. It was a logistical nightmare, but Langdon had faced impossible odds before. This time, though, the stakes were higher. These weren't just human lives they were saving. They were venturing into unknown territory, both literally and figuratively. "Send out a universal message," Langdon ordered. "Let them know we're here to help." The communications officer, Lieutenant Harris, relayed the message in the simplest terms possible, relying on universal codes and symbols. For a few agonizing minutes, there was no response. Then, A faint, static-laden voice crackled through the speakers. The words were halting and unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakably one of relief. "They're responding, Commander," Harris confirmed, his voice tinged with both surprise and hope. The first contact was tentative, a delicate dance of mutual caution. The alien species, identified as the Elvari, were humanoid in shape but distinctly alien in appearance. Their translucent skin shimmered faintly, reflecting hues of blue and green, and their large, expressive eyes conveyed a depth of emotion that words struggled to capture. They were wary of the humans but too desperate to refuse assistance. Their leader, a being who introduced herself as Selena, explained the situation as best she could. They had been ambushed by an unknown enemy while traveling through a nearby sector. Their ships had been outnumbered and outgunned, forced into a retreat that left them stranded in hostile territory. Supplies were dwindling, and their wounded were overwhelming the limited medical facilities that remained operational. They hadn't expected anyone to come. In fact, they hadn't expected to survive much longer. Langdon listened carefully, her expression unwavering. "We'll do what we can," she promised, "but we'll need your cooperation. We can't save you if you don't trust us." Selena hesitated, her gaze flickering between Langdon and the rest of the human crew. The Elvari were a proud people, unaccustomed to accepting help, especially from outsiders. But pride had no place in survival, and Selena knew it. She nodded, a small but significant gesture. As the rescue operation began, it became clear just how dire the situation was. The Elvari ships were on the brink of collapse, their systems so compromised that even the slightest misstep could spell disaster. Human engineers worked tirelessly, their hands deftly repairing alien technology that was both fascinating and baffling. Medics tended to the wounded, their compassion cutting through the barriers of language and culture. The security team remained on high alert, scanning for any signs of the attackers who had left the Elvari in this state. Hours turned into days as the humans fought against time and entropy. Every success was hard-won, every setback a reminder of how precarious the situation remained. And yet, amidst the chaos, bonds began to form. The Elvari, initially reserved and distant, started to open up. They watched in awe as the humans worked with relentless determination, their ingenuity and grit a stark contrast to the cold efficiency of most galactic species. For the Elvari, who had long dismissed humanity as insignificant, it was a humbling experience. But not everything was as it seemed. As the repairs neared completion and the wounded stabilized, an uneasy feeling began to creep through the Resolute. Strange readings appeared on the sensors, faint, erratic signals that suggested something, or someone, was nearby. Langdon couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched, and her instincts had never failed her before. One night, as the ship's crew finally allowed themselves a moment of rest, a piercing alarm shattered the fragile calm. The enemy had returned. The alarm's wail jolted everyone into action. Lights flickered as the crew scrambled to their stations, their exhaustion vanishing in the face of renewed danger. Commander Langdon barked orders, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. The bridge was a whirlwind of movement, as sensors locked onto the incoming signatures, and tactical displays lit up with a dozen unidentified ships closing in fast. They came back. Lieutenant Harris muttered, his hands flying across the console to enhance the scans. His voice carried a mix of dread and frustration, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why now, when the humans had nearly stabilized the fleet? The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Langdon stood stiffly, her eyes locked on the display. The enemy ships were sleek and angular, their designs unfamiliar even to Earth's expansive database of galactic vessels. Whoever these attackers were, they weren't here for negotiation. The human ship was outgunned, and the Elvari were in no condition to fight. This wasn't a battle they could win outright. It was survival now, pure and simple. "Defensive measures online," Langdon ordered. "Get the Elvari ships on comms and tell them to hold position. We'll buy time to get their engines running. Move." The crew leaped into action, but Langdon knew it wasn't enough. She needed more than just quick responses and bravery. She needed a plan. She glanced at Dr. Torrin, who was analyzing the data streaming in from the enemy vessels. "Anything on who or what we're dealing with?" she asked. "Not much," Torrent replied, his face pale. "Their tech is advanced, far beyond ours. They're not broadcasting any identifiers, and their energy signatures don't match known factions. This might be a new player." Or an old one, Langdon thought grimly, keeping the suspicion to herself. The galaxy was full of forgotten threats lurking in the shadows, remnants of wars long past or experiments that had gone terribly wrong. Whatever these ships were, they had no interest in diplomacy. The enemy vessels began to spread out, encircling the crippled fleet like wolves closing in on their prey. The human shields flared as the first volley struck, the ship shuddering under the impact. Langdon gripped the edge of her console, her mind racing. She needed to keep the enemy focused on the Resolute. If they turned their attention to the Elveri, it would be a massacre. "Fire countermeasures and deploy drones," Langdon commanded. "Keep them guessing. If they want us, let's make them work for it." The hull reverberated as the ship's weapon systems engaged, launching a barrage of flares and decoys. The drones, small and agile, zipped through the enemy formation, weaving patterns designed to confuse targeting systems. It was a strategy born from humanity's history of fighting against impossible odds. Improvisation and misdirection were their strongest weapons. Meanwhile, the Elveri were struggling to comprehend the humans' actions. Selena, watching from the bridge of her damaged flagship, couldn't hide her astonishment. The humans were throwing themselves into harm's way with reckless abandon, shielding the Elveri with no expectation of reward. It was baffling. No other species would act so selflessly, especially for strangers. "What are they doing?" one of her officers asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They'll be destroyed." Selena didn't answer. She didn't know. All she could do was watch as the Resolute darted between enemy fire, its crew fighting with a tenacity that bordered on madness. In the chaos, Langdon received a desperate message from the engineering team working aboard one of the Elveri ships. Their leader, a resourceful young technician named Flynn, reported that they had managed to restart the ship's engines, but at a cost. The repairs were unstable, and pushing the systems too hard could result in catastrophic failure. "Do it anyway," Langdon replied. "We don't have the luxury of playing it safe. Get them moving and make sure they follow our lead." Flynn hesitated but obeyed, his voice tight with the strain of holding the fragile systems together. One by one, the Elveri ships began to stir, their engines flickering to life like embers in a dying fire. The sight filled Langdon with a sliver of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by a new wave of enemy attacks. They were adapting, their movements sharper and more coordinated. The humans' tricks wouldn't hold them off much longer. In the medbay, the scene was no less intense. Human and Elveri medics worked side by side, stabilizing the injured as the ship rocked with each hit. Despite their exhaustion, the humans continued to press forward, their determination inspiring their alien counterparts. One Elveri medic, her delicate hands trembling as she worked on a critically injured crew member, turned to her human partner. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of machinery. "You don't know us. You owe us nothing." The human, a grizzled medic named Connor, didn't look up from his work. "Because it's what we do," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We help." The Elveri medic fell silent, her mind racing. The humans were unlike any species she had encountered before. Their actions defied logic, driven by something deeper than survival or self-interest. It was both inspiring and unsettling. Back on the bridge, the situation grew more desperate. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons growing more precise with each volley. The shields of the Resolute were faltering, the warning lights on Langdon's console flashing red. She knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "Commander," Harris shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "New signatures incoming. A lot of them." Langdon's heart sank. Reinforcements for the enemy, she thought. This was it. But as the new vessels appeared on the sensors, her breath caught. They weren't enemy ships. They were Elveri. A second fleet, larger and more heavily armed, was emerging from hyperspace, their arrival a beacon of hope. Selena's voice crackled over the comms, filled with a mix of relief and determination. Reinforcements have arrived. You've given us a chance, Commander. Now let us return the favor. The Elveri fleet charged into the fray, their weapons lighting up the darkness as they engaged the enemy with a ferocity that surprised even Langdon. The tide of the battle began to shift, but the enemy wasn't retreating. If anything, they seemed more determined, as if something deeper was at stake. Langdon watched the unfolding chaos, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Who were these attackers? What did they want? And why did they seem so intent on destroying the Elveri, even at the cost of their own lives? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. The battle raged on, the vacuum of space lit up by explosions and energy bursts. The reinforced Elveri fleet fought valiantly, but the enemy ships displayed a terrifying level of precision. Their attacks grew sharper with each passing moment, as if they were learning, adapting to every countermeasure the humans and Elveri threw at them. It felt less like a battle and more like a game of attrition, one they were slowly losing. Commander Langdon's hands were steady as she directed her crew, but her voice carried an edge that betrayed her concern. The enemy's behavior was too calculated, too methodical. This wasn't a simple act of war. It was something else entirely. Every instinct screamed that there was a larger design behind this relentless assault, but the why of it remained maddeningly out of reach. "We're running out of drones," Lieutenant Harris reported, his voice tight, "and our shields won't hold much longer." Langdon glanced at the tactical display. The enemy ships had begun to cluster around the remaining Elveri vessels, their movements like predators circling wounded prey. The reinforcements had helped even the odds, but the enemy's strategy was relentless, targeting the most vulnerable ships with chilling efficiency. If they broke through to the heart of the fleet, it would be catastrophic. "Get me Selena," Langdon ordered. Moments later, the Elveri leader's image appeared on the comm screen. Her translucent skin glistened with sweat, and her large, expressive eyes betrayed exhaustion and worry. "Commander," she said, her voice tight, "we're holding, but barely. What's your plan?" Langdon's jaw tightened. She didn't have a plan, not one that guaranteed survival. But she wasn't about to admit that. "We need to buy time," she said. "Can your fleet focus fire on their rear formation? If we can break their line, we might create an opening to escape." Selena hesitated, her gaze flickering to someone off-screen. "We'll try," she said finally, "but our ships aren't built for prolonged combat. If this fails—" "We don't fail," Langdon cut in, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "We survive. That's all that matters now." Selena nodded, and the transmission ended. Langdon turned back to her crew, her mind racing. If the Elveri could punch a hole in the enemy's formation, it might give them a chance to slip away. But it was a long shot, and even if it worked, they'd still have to contend with the unknowns. "Commander," Dr. Torrance said quietly, drawing her attention, "I've been analyzing their attack patterns. There's something deliberate about them. It's almost as if they're testing us, probing for weaknesses. I don't think they're just here to destroy the fleet." Langdon frowned. "Then what do they want?" Torn hesitated. "I don't know, but it's not random. There's a purpose to this, and I don't think we're seeing the full picture." Langdon didn't have time to dwell on Torrance' theory. The Elveri fleet launched a coordinated assault on the enemy's rear, their weapons lighting up the darkness with a ferocity born of desperation. The enemy ships responded in kind, their formation shifting to meet the new threat. For a moment, it seemed like the plan might work. A gap began to form in the enemy lines, a slim corridor through which the fleet could escape. But then, as if anticipating the maneuver, the enemy ships adjusted again, cutting off the opening with unnerving precision. Langdon's heart sank. Whoever, or whatever, they were up against, they were far more advanced than anything she had faced before. "Commander, we're detecting strange energy signatures," Harris said, his voice sharp with alarm. "They're coming from the enemy ships." Langdon's stomach tightened. "What kind of energy?" "Unknown," Torn interjected, his eyes glued to his console. "But it's powerful, if they're preparing some kind of weapon." An explosion rocked the Resolute, sending crew members tumbling as the ship's stabilizers struggled to compensate. Warning lights blared across the bridge, and the acrid smell of burning circuitry filled the air. Langdon gripped the edge of her station, her mind racing. Whatever the enemy was doing, it was escalating. "They're targeting our engines," Harris shouted. "If they disable us, we're sitting ducks." Langdon made a snap decision. "Divert all power to shields and propulsion. We need to keep moving." "But Commander, our weapons." Harris started. "Forget the weapons," Langdon snapped. "We're not winning this fight. Our priority is keeping the fleet alive." The ship lurched as another volley struck, but the shields held for now. Langdon glanced at the tactical display. The Elveri were holding their own, but barely. Their ships were taking heavy damage, and it was only a matter of time before they started to fall. Then, without warning, the enemy ships began to withdraw. It wasn't a retreat. Not exactly. Their movements were too controlled, too deliberate. They pulled back just enough to regroup, their formation tightening into an impenetrable wall. It was as if they were preparing for something. "What are they doing?" Langdon murmured, her eyes narrowing. Torrent's console beeped, and his expression darkened. "Commander, I think I know why they're here. The energy signatures. They're focused on the Elveri flagship. On Selena." Langdon's blood ran cold. "Why?" "I don't know," Torrent admitted, "but whatever they're after, it's on that ship. Or in it." Langdon's mind raced. If the enemy was targeting Selena specifically, it meant there was something, or someone, aboard her ship that they wanted. And if they were willing to risk so much to get it, it had to be important. "We need to protect that ship," Langdon said, her voice firm. "Harris, patch me through to Selena." The Elveri leader's face appeared on the comm screen, her expression grim. "Commander," she said, "I assume you've noticed their movements." "They're after you," Langdon said bluntly. "What's on your ship that they want?" Selena hesitated, her eyes flickering with something that Langdon couldn't quite place. "I can't say," she said finally. "But you're right. They won't stop until they have it." Langdon's jaw tightened. "Then we need to move. If we can draw them away." "No," Selena interrupted, her voice resolute. "If they get what they're after, it won't just be my people who suffer. The entire galaxy could be at risk." Langdon stared at her, the weight of Selena's words sinking in. This wasn't just a battle. It was a race against something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. And as the enemy ships began to advance again, their intentions clear, Langdon realized that the real fight was only just beginning. The enemy fleet surged forward, their formation tightening like a vice. Selena's warning echoed in Langdon's mind, the weight of her words pressing heavily on her shoulders. Whatever was on the Elveri flagship, it was worth an all-out assault. Langdon didn't need to understand why. It was enough to know they couldn't let the enemy win. "Shift our position to cover Selena's ship," Langdon ordered. "We're the distraction now. Make sure we look like the bigger target." Harris hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "Commander, if they focus everything on us." "They will," Langdon cut him off. "And that's the point. Move." The Resolute veered sharply, placing itself between the advancing enemy fleet and the Elveri flagship. The ship's shields flared under another barrage of fire, each hit sending tremors through the hull. Langdon gripped the edge of her console, steadying herself as the bridge filled with the shrill sounds of alarms. Every second they held the line was another second for the Elveri to regroup. But even as the humans braced for the next wave of attacks, Langdon couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Dr. Torrent, hunched over his station, suddenly straightened. "Commander, I've been analyzing their energy signatures again," he said, urgency in his voice. "There's a pattern, a frequency embedded in their transmissions. It's almost like a signal." "A signal?" Langdon's brow furrowed. "To what?" "I don't know," Torrent admitted, "but it's not just between their ships. It's directed outward, as if they're trying to communicate with something, or someone." Langdon's stomach sank. "Are you saying this isn't the full force, that they're calling for reinforcements?" "It's possible, Torrance said, his voice low. But it could be more than that, if this is part of a larger plan. Before he could finish, a new alert blared across the bridge. Harris's face went pale as he scanned the incoming data. Commander, we've got another incoming fleet, larger than the first. Langdon's heart pounded. Enemy? Harris hesitated. Unknown. Their ships don't match the others' design. The tension on the bridge was palpable as the new fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Their vessels were massive, with sleek silver hulls that glinted ominously against the backdrop of stars. The enemy ships hesitated for a moment, their formation shifting as if recalibrating their strategy. The two fleets faced each other, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though the newcomers might intervene on behalf of the humans and Elveri. But then the newcomers turned their weapons toward the Elveri fleet. Langdon's breath caught. They're hostile. Confirmed, Harris said grimly. They're targeting the flagship. Selena's voice crackled over the comms, her tone laced with desperation. Commander, these ships, they're ancient. They match records from our archives, relics from a forgotten war. They shouldn't even exist. Langdon's mind raced. The galaxy was littered with ruins and relics from civilizations long gone, their histories lost to time. If these ships were truly from such an era, it raised a terrifying question. Who had awakened them, and why now? More importantly, what did they want with the Elveri? Two fleets against us, Harris said quietly. We're not walking away from this, Commander. Langdon ignored the remark, her focus shifting to the tactical display. The enemy forces were moving in unison now, their combined firepower dwarfing anything the humans or Elveri could muster. But it wasn't the sheer strength of their assault that unsettled her. It was their precision. The way they converged on Selena's ship left no doubt in her mind. This wasn't just a battle. It was a surgical operation. Selena, Langdon said, her voice sharp. You need to tell me what's on your ship. If we're going to have any chance of stopping them, I need to know. Selena hesitated, and for a moment, Langdon thought she might refuse. But then the Elveri leader spoke, her voice heavy with resignation. It's not what's on my ship, Commander. It's who. Langdon felt a chill run down her spine. Explain. There's someone aboard, Selena said. An elder of our kind. She's unique. Her knowledge spans millennia, and her abilities. She broke off, as if the words were too much to say aloud. She's the last of her kind. If they take her, they'll gain access to everything she knows. Every secret, every weakness. Langdon's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Would it have changed anything? Selena countered. You've already done more than we could have hoped for. But if you stay, you'll be destroyed. I can't ask you to sacrifice your people for us. Langdon's grip on the console tightened. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but there was no time. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons charging for what could only be a final, decisive strike. Get the Elder to an escape pod, Langdon said. We'll cover you. If she's their target, we can draw them away. She won't go, Selena said bitterly. She believes this is her burden to bear. Langdon opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the ship shook violently. Sparks flew from the consoles, and the lights flickered as another barrage struck the Resolute. Harris shouted over the chaos, his voice barely audible. Commander, we've got boarding parties. They're coming in hot. Langdon's heart pounded as she processed the news. The enemy wasn't just trying to destroy the fleet. They were coming to take what they wanted by force. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a race against time, and the stakes had just become terrifyingly clear. The enemy boarding parties came swiftly, breaching the hull of the Resolute with surgical precision. Alarms blared, and the ship's corridors filled with the sounds of battle as the crew fought to repel the invaders. Langdon moved with purpose, leading a small team toward the aft sections where the breaches were the most severe. The enemy soldiers were unlike anything they had faced before. Sleek, humanoid machines with glowing cores and weapons that seemed to anticipate every move. The humans fought valiantly, but it was clear they were outmatched in raw power. Langdon ducked behind cover as a burst of energy scorched the air above her head. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but her focus was razor sharp. "Fall back to the secondary bulkheads," she ordered. "We need to slow them down. Torin, status on the Elveri flagship." Torin's voice crackled over the comms, strained but steady. "They've managed to isolate the Elder in the command center, but they're under heavy fire. I don't think they'll hold for much longer." Langdon clenched her jaw. The battle was slipping out of their control, and she knew it. The combined fleets were relentless, their precision suggesting a singular will driving them forward. But they had come too far to abandon the Elveri now. If the Elder truly held knowledge that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy, letting her fall into enemy hands wasn't an option. "Harris, give me a way to hit them where it hurts," Langdon barked as she fired a shot that ricocheted harmlessly off an advancing machine. "We need an edge." Harris's voice came through, tight with urgency. "There's one option, Commander. We could overload the ship's reactor. It'll create a massive EMP, enough to disable the machines and give the Elveri a chance to escape." Langdon hesitated, her mind racing. Overloading the reactor would disable the enemy, but it would also leave the Resolute dead in space, defenseless against the Second Fleet. It was a gamble with no guarantees, but as she glanced around at her crew, their faces set with grim determination, she realized there was no other choice. "Do it," she said, "but give me 5 minutes. I'm going to get to Selena's ship." "Commander," Harris started, but Langdon cut him off. "Just do it, Harris. That's an order." She turned to her team. "Hold this position as long as you can. Buy me time." Without waiting for a response, Langdon sprinted toward the docking bay. The corridors were a chaotic mess of fire and smoke, but she pushed forward, her determination outweighing her fear. By the time she reached the docking bay, the Resolute's automated defenses were barely holding off the advancing machines. A battered Elveri shuttle waited at the far end, its engines sputtering to life. Langdon boarded the shuttle, her breath ragged as she slammed the hatch shut. The pilot, a young Elveri soldier, nodded silently, his hands steady on the controls. The shuttle launched into the chaos, weaving through debris and enemy fire as it closed the distance to the flagship. The Elveri command center was a scene of devastation. Langdon stepped over the remains of fallen defenders, her weapon at the ready as she followed the sound of combat. She found Selena and a handful of survivors barricaded behind a makeshift wall, their weapons trained on the corridor ahead. At the center of the room stood the Elder, her presence almost otherworldly. Her translucent skin glowed faintly, and her gaze was calm despite the chaos around her. "We're out of time," Langdon said, her voice sharp. "We need to move now." The Elder's eyes met Langdon's, and for a moment it felt as though the room had gone silent. "You are brave," the Elder said softly, her voice carrying an unnatural weight, "but bravery will not save you." Langdon stepped closer. "What will then?" "Tell me, because we're running out of options." The Elder hesitated, her gaze distant. "There is something they do not understand," she said. "They seek knowledge, but knowledge is not power. It is the will to use it that matters." Before Langdon could respond, the room shook violently. The machines had breached the outer defenses. Selena grabbed Langdon's arm, her expression desperate. "We can't hold them off any longer." Langdon turned to the Elder. "We're leaving. Now." The Elder nodded, but as they moved toward the shuttle, she stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on the corridor. "Go," she said quietly. "I will stay." Langdon spun around. "What? No, you're the reason we're fighting this. We're not leaving without you." The Elder smiled faintly. "You misunderstand. My knowledge is already yours. I've given it to her." She nodded toward Selena. "They do not know this. Let them believe they've won." Langdon opened her mouth to argue, but the Elder raised a hand. "Go," she said firmly. "You have a galaxy to protect." Langdon hesitated, but Selena pulled her toward the shuttle. "We have to trust her," Selena said. "It's the only way." The shuttle launched just as the reactor on the Resolute overloaded. The EMP wave spread out in a brilliant flash, disabling the machines and sending the Second Fleet into disarray. But even as the humans and Elveri escaped, Langdon couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of this enemy. As the shuttle entered hyperspace, Langdon turned to Selena. "What did she give you?" Selena hesitated, then opened her hand to reveal a small, glowing crystal. "The key to understanding what they fear most," she said, "and the means to stop them." Langdon stared at the crystal, a mix of hope and dread coursing through her. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning, and whatever secrets the Elder had left behind, they would have to be enough. The shuttle emerged from hyperspace into a quiet sector of space, far from the battle that had raged only hours before. Langdon sat silently in the cockpit, watching the stars drift past as she tried to process everything that had happened. The Resolute was gone, the crew scattered across the Elvery ships that had managed to escape. The price of survival had been steep, but they were alive. For now, that had to be enough. Selena sat across from her, the glowing crystal still clutched tightly in her hand. She had said little since they escaped, her gaze distant as if she were searching for answers that refused to come. Langdon finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Selena looked up, her expression weary but determined. "We learn," she said simply. "The Elder trusted us with this for a reason. Whatever knowledge is inside this crystal, it's the key to understanding what we're up against. We have to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Langdon nodded, though the weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. They had bought themselves time, but the enemy was still out there, regrouping, planning, and there was still the question of the Second Fleet, the ancient, reawakened ships that had joined the fray. The Elder's sacrifice had given them a chance, but Langdon knew that chance would mean nothing if they didn't act. They docked with one of the Elvery cruisers, a sleek vessel that bore the scars of the battle. The surviving crew from the Resolute greeted Langdon with a mix of relief and grief, their faces pale and drawn. Harris approached her, his uniform singed but his posture steady. "Good to see you made it out, Commander." "You too," Langdon said. She paused, unsure of how to address the loss of their ship and the lives they had left behind. Instead, she said, "We need to regroup, find out what resources we have left and figure out our next move." Harris nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "The crew's shaken, but they'll follow your lead. They always do." As Langdon moved through the ship, she couldn't help but notice the uneasy alliance between the humans and the Elvery. The shared trauma of the battle had brought them together, but there was an underlying tension that couldn't be ignored. Some of the humans avoided looking directly at the Elvery, while others whispered among themselves. Langdon knew it would take time to build trust, but she also knew they didn't have the luxury of waiting. The enemy wouldn't give them that. Selena called a meeting in the ship's central chamber, a wide circular room with a holographic display at its center. Langdon, Harris, and a handful of other leaders gathered around as Selena placed the crystal on the display. The hologram flared to life, projecting intricate patterns of light that shifted and morphed like a living thing. It was beautiful, but also unsettling, like staring into something that was never meant to be fully understood. "This crystal contains the Elder's memories," Selena explained. "Not just her own, but those of her ancestors. It's a repository of everything they've seen, learned, and feared. If we can unlock it, we might find the answers we need. Or it might lead them straight to us," Harris said, his tone cautious. "What if it's a trap? Something the enemy planted to track us?" "It's not a trap," Selena said firmly. "The Elder wouldn't have sacrificed herself if she thought it would put us in danger." Langdon stepped forward. "We don't have a choice. Whatever's in there, we need to understand it. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. This might be the only chance we have." The others nodded reluctantly, and Selena began the process of decoding the crystal. The hologram grew brighter, its patterns becoming more defined as it started to reveal fragments of information. Images of ancient civilizations flashed before their eyes, worlds thriving with life, only to be consumed by darkness. There were faces, voices, and symbols that none of them recognized, but the message was clear. This enemy had been here before. They had destroyed countless civilizations, leaving only ruins and legends in their wake. Langdon felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the scope of what they were up against. This wasn't just about the Elvari or even humanity. It was about the survival of the galaxy itself. The enemy wasn't seeking power or territory. They were seeking something far more profound, an end to resistance, an end to free will. The crystal's final message was the most haunting. A single phrase, spoken in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of time. The key lies within. What does it mean? Harris asked, his voice tense. I don't know, Selena admitted, but I think the Elder believed it was something we already have. Something they can't take from us. Langdon stared at the hologram, her mind racing. The Elder had said knowledge wasn't power. It was the will to use it. Maybe that was the key. The enemy could destroy ships, conquer worlds, and erase histories, but they couldn't erase the will to fight, to survive, to hope. That was something no amount of firepower could take away. As the crew debated their next steps, a message came through from one of the Elvari scouts. The enemy fleets were regrouping near a distant star system, their numbers growing as more ships arrived. It was clear they were preparing for another assault, one that would leave no survivors. Langdon made her decision. We hit them first, she said. We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them. The room fell silent, but no one argued. They all knew the risks, but they also knew there was no other way. The combined human and Elvari forces began preparing for the assault, pooling their resources and training together as a single unit. It was a desperate gamble, but it was also their only chance. When the time came, the fleet emerged from hyperspace on the edge of the enemy's stronghold. The battle that followed was unlike anything Langdon had ever seen. Ships clashed in a chaotic dance of fire and light, the void filled with the screams of dying vessels. The humans and Elvari fought with everything they had, their determination outweighing their fear. In the end, it wasn't firepower or technology that won the day. It was their unity, their refusal to give up, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Langdon's fleet managed to break through the enemy lines, targeting their command ships and disrupting their coordination. The enemy, for all their precision and strength, faltered when faced with the sheer will of their opponents. As the battle ended and the enemy fleet retreated, Langdon stood on the bridge of the Elvari cruiser, watching the stars. They had won, but the cost had been high. Ships were lost, lives were taken, and the scars of the battle would linger for a long time. But they had proven something, that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was still light. Selena approached her, the crystal now dim in her hand. The Elder was right, she said quietly. The key was never in the crystal. It was in us. Langdon nodded, her gaze steady. Let's make sure we never forget that. The crew began the long journey home, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had not only survived but triumphed. The galaxy was still full of dangers, but it was also full of hope. And as Langdon looked around at the people who had fought by her side, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together.